A little homeless girl offers to pay a millionaire's groceries, but when they find out who she is, this happens. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos. The insistent beep of the card machine echoed through the Safeway supermarket like a hammer pounding on Richard Sterling's pride. 52 years old, 30 years building an empire in the construction supply business, and now he stood there, paralyzed in front of the checkout, as the message, "Transaction denied," flashed on the small screen. "Must be a problem with the system," he muttered to the young cashier, his hands trembling slightly as he tried the card again. Sweat began to form small beads on his forehead, even with the store's air conditioning running full blast. Around him, the line grew. Martha, the pharmacist's wife, whispered something to her friend. Young Johnny Peterson, the mayor's son, discreetly pointed his cell phone in his direction. Richard knew every face there. This was his town, where his family had roots for 3 generations, where he himself had grown up running through the brick-paved streets. "Sir, the system is working normally," the cashier said gently, but her voice carried that tone everyone uses when they don't know how to handle an embarrassing situation. "Do you have another card?" Richard pulled out his imported leather wallet, his fingers automatically searching for the second card, then the third. With each attempt, the same result. Denied, denied, denied. The conversations around him became more audible. The whispers turned into open comments. "Can't be true." Richard Sterling broke. After all that arrogance. Each word was like a needle prick in his chest. Richard Sterling, the man who had built the largest construction supply company in the region, who employed 200 people, whose name was on signs all over town, stood there, unable to pay a grocery bill of $200. His mind raced, trying to understand what had happened. The day before, everything was normal. His company, Sterling Construction, had ongoing contracts, projects spread across 5 neighboring counties. Mary, his wife, had used her card that morning without any problems. How was it possible that all his accounts were blocked? "I need to make a call," he said, his voice lower than he intended. "Can you hold my groceries?" That's when he felt a soft touch on his leg. He looked down and saw a little girl, no more than 4 years old, with tattered clothes that had once been white, but were now the indefinable color of dust and time. Her brown hair was disheveled, but her eyes shone with a purity that contrasted with the heavy atmosphere around her. "I'll pay for your groceries, mister," she said, extending a small, dirty hand where a few coins rested. "I have money." The entire supermarket seemed to freeze. All eyes turned to that surreal scene, the richest man in town receiving an offer of help from a homeless girl. Richard felt his face burn, a mixture of shame and indignation rising in his chest. His first reaction was irritation. How had a street child managed to get into the supermarket? Where was security? But when his eyes met hers again, something strange happened. There was a sincerity there, a genuine kindness that completely disarmed him. "That's okay, little one," he managed to say, his voice softer now. "Thank you, but you don't have to." "But you're sad," the girl insisted, taking a step closer. "My Aunt Bernice always says that when someone is sad, we have to help." Bernice. Richard frowned. That name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place where he had heard it before. The girl remained there, her hand extended, patiently waiting for him to accept her offer. "Iris, come here, honey," a female voice called from across the supermarket. A woman in her late 30s approached quickly, clearly embarrassed by the situation. Her clothes were simple but clean, and there was a dignity in her steps despite the obvious circumstances of financial hardship. "I'm sorry for the trouble, sir," the woman said, placing her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Iris, I told you not to bother people." "But he's sad, Aunt Bernice," the child protested. "And I have money to help." Bernice. The name hit Richard like a lightning bolt. His memories began to rearrange themselves, bringing to mind a face he had tried to forget. Bernice Carter, his former accountant, the woman who had worked at his company for 3 years and whom he had abruptly fired. How long ago? 5 years? 6? He studied her discreetly as she apologized and tried to take the girl away. The face was the same, but thinner, marked by hardships. The hands, which were once always well-groomed for the corporate environment, now showed signs of hard work. "Bernice," he said, almost in disbelief. She froze. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. There was a moment of mutual recognition, heavy with the weight of unearthed memories. Richard saw something pass through her eyes. Surprise, pain, maybe even a little fear. "Mr. Sterling," she said simply, her voice controlled but tense. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone in the supermarket. The former employee and the child she cared for offering help to the former boss, who now found himself in the humiliating situation of having his cards declined. Richard felt the weight of dozens of curious glances on him. He knew that by the end of the day, the story would be spread throughout the town. Richard Sterling, the proud businessman, saved by a homeless girl. "We're leaving," Bernice said quickly, pulling Iris by the hand. "Sorry for the inconvenience again." But as they walked away, Richard couldn't take his eyes off little Iris, who looked back with those big, worried eyes. There was something about that child that touched a part of himself that he thought he had lost long ago. The supermarket manager approached discreetly. "Mr. Sterling, don't worry about the groceries. We can put it on your tab and you can settle it later." But Richard wasn't listening anymore. His mind was divided between the humiliation of the present and the memories that were beginning to resurface about Bernice Carter and the circumstances of her dismissal. Circumstances that, he now realized, might be directly linked to the situation he himself was in. Richard arrived home empty-handed and his pride in tatters. His residence, an imposing building in the most upscale neighborhood in town, seemed strangely silent that afternoon. The automatic gate worked normally. At least the basic systems were still operating. Mary wasn't home, probably at one of her endless meetings of the Women's Social Club or at her private Pilates class. At 45, his wife maintained a rigid schedule of social commitments that, according to her, were essential to maintain the family's position in local society. He sat heavily in his leather armchair in the home office and picked up the phone. The first call was to the bank. After waiting on hold for 15 irritating minutes, he finally managed to speak to the manager. "Mr. Sterling, your accounts have been blocked by court order," the manager explained with evident discomfort. "A warrant arrived yesterday afternoon. I can't give you more details over the phone, but you need to come in person tomorrow morning." Court order. The words echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. Richard hung up the phone and immediately called Tom Guerrero, his accountant and confidant for over a decade. "Tom, I need you to come here now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have a serious problem." "What kind of problem, boss?" Tom asked, but there was something strange in his voice, a hesitation that Richard couldn't identify at the moment. "All my accounts have been blocked. Court order." A long silence followed. I'm on my way," Tom finally said. While he waited, Richard allowed himself to remember Bernice Carter. She had been hired in 2016 during a period of expansion for the company. She was a competent professional, detail-oriented, always arrived early and left late. She had a degree in accounting from the State University and a dedication to her work that he respected. But in 2019, during a crisis in the construction sector that affected the entire region, Richard had made some questionable decisions. Nothing completely illegal, just some adjustments to the numbers to reduce the company's tax burden. Common practices in the industry, at least that's what he told himself at the time. Bernice had discovered the irregularities. He clearly remembered the morning she knocked on his office door with a folder full of documents in her hands and a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Sterling, "We need to talk about some discrepancies I found in the reports," she had said. He had been irritated, not with the irregularities themselves, but with the fact that an employee was questioning his business decisions. His pride, always his worst enemy, had spoken louder than reason. "Bernice, you were hired to execute, not to question my strategies," he had replied sharply. "If you're not satisfied with the way I run my company, maybe it's better to look for another job," she had tried to explain, insisting that she was just trying to protect the company from future problems. But Richard, blinded by arrogance and pressured by the financial crisis, had interpreted her concern as insubordination. "You're fired," he had said, without even looking at the documents she had brought. "Tom will take care of the transition." The dismissal had been processed the same day. Bernice had left the company taking only her personal belongings, without the right to a proper explanation or a letter of recommendation. At the time, Richard had felt entitled to act that way. After all, he was the owner of the company. Now, 5 years later, the consequences of his arrogance were coming back to haunt him. Tom arrived an hour later, but not alone. Mary was with him, something that immediately caught Richard's attention. His wife rarely got involved with company matters, claiming that she didn't understand business. "Richard, honey, Tom told me about the problem with the accounts," Mary said, kissing him on the cheek with her usual affectionate coldness. "What an unpleasant situation." "What do you know about this?" Richard asked, studying his wife's face. "Just what Tom explained to me on the way," she replied quickly. "Some tax issue, isn't it?" Tom nodded but avoided Richard's direct gaze. "Boss, I received a notice from the IRS this morning. Apparently, there's an ongoing investigation into possible irregularities in the company's reports between 2018 and 2020. "What kind of irregularities?" Richard asked, although he already knew the answer. "Tax evasion, underreporting of revenue, use of fake invoices for artificial tax reduction," Tom listed, each word falling like a stone in Richard's stomach. The bitter irony of the situation did not escape him. Exactly the irregularities that Bernice had discovered and tried to warn him about. If he had listened to her at the time, if he had corrected the problems then, maybe none of this would be happening now. "How did they find out?" Richard asked. "Anonymous tip," Tom replied. "Someone submitted detailed documents to the IRS 6 months ago. The investigation was running in secret until now." Richard sat down again, the weight of the situation falling on him like an avalanche. Anonymous tip, with detailed documents. It could only be Bernice. She had kept the evidence of the irregularities, and years later had decided to avenge the unfair dismissal. "Is there any way to reverse this?" Mary asked, and there was something in her voice that Richard couldn't identify. Urgency, nervousness. "We'll have to hire a lawyer specializing in tax law," Tom replied, "and we'll probably have to reach an agreement with the IRS, paying the taxes owed plus penalties and interest." "How much are we talking about?" Richard asked. Tom and Mary exchanged a quick glance, something that did not go unnoticed by Richard. "Difficult to calculate without seeing all the case files, but it could be a significant amount." The phone rang, interrupting the tense conversation. Richard answered impatiently. "Mr. Sterling?" The voice was from John, the manager of one of the company's construction sites. "Sir, some IRS inspectors arrived here with a sealing order. They are stopping the progress of the work and requesting all the tax documentation for the last 5 years. Richard closed his eyes. "How many sites?" "So far, 3. But it looks like they're going to go through all of them." When he hung up, Mary and Tom were watching him in silence. The scale of the catastrophe was beginning to become clear. It wasn't just a matter of paying fines. His entire operation was being paralyzed. "I need to find Bernice Carter," Richard said finally. "What for?" Mary asked quickly. "She was my accountant. She's the one who made the report. Maybe I can talk to her, reach an agreement." Tom cleared his throat. "Boss, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Any direct contact with the whistleblower can be interpreted as an attempt at coercion." But Richard wasn't listening to advice. His mind was fixed on the image of Bernice in the supermarket, visibly in financial difficulty, taking care of that little girl who had offered her coins to help him. If she was in need, maybe there was a way to resolve the situation that would benefit both of them. "Where does she live now?" he asked. I don't know," Tom replied. "After she left the company, we lost contact." Richard looked out the window, watching the sun set over his town, over the empire he had built, and that was now crumbling. Somewhere in those streets, Bernice Carter was taking care of a 4-year-old girl who had more generosity in her heart than he had shown in his entire adult life. And now, cruelly and ironically, she held the power to completely destroy everything he had built. The next 3 days were a bureaucratic hell for Richard. Lawyers, documents, tense meetings where astronomical numbers were mentioned as if they were simple statistics. The initial fine, calculated by the IRS, reached $800,000, almost half of his entire net worth. Dr. Edward Lawson, the tax attorney that Tom had recommended, got straight to the point during the first meeting. "Mr. Sterling, the situation is serious. The documents presented in the complaint are extremely detailed and organized. Whoever did this had in-depth knowledge of the company's accounting." Each word confirmed his suspicions about Bernice. But the more he thought about her, the more a strange unease grew in his chest. During those 3 days, whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the face of little Iris, extending her dirty coins to him. There was something about that child that stirred some forgotten part of his soul. On Thursday morning, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of going to another meeting with lawyers, he drove downtown to look for Bernice and the girl. He started with the obvious places: the town square, where there were always homeless people asking for help; the traffic light on Main Street, where he knew some homeless people stayed during the day. Nothing. Then he remembered Mrs. Connie, a lady who always did volunteer work in the city and knew practically all the families in difficulty. He found her organizing donations at the downtown church. "Bernice Carter?" Mrs. Connie repeated when he asked. "Of course I know her. A very hard-working young woman, poor thing. Lives with a little girl, Iris. Works as a cleaning lady in 3 different places to manage to support herself." "Do you know where they live?" Mrs. Connie studied him curiously. "May I ask why the interest, Mr. Sterling? It's not common to see businessmen looking for people like Bernice." Richard hesitated. He couldn't tell the truth, that he needed to find the woman who had possibly reported him and was destroying his life. "It's a personal matter. She worked for me a few years ago. They live in a small room in the back of Mrs. Judy's house on Elm Street," Mrs. Connie said finally. "But, Mr. Sterling, if I may offer some advice, that little girl has been very sick. A cough that won't go away, constant fevers. Bernice is desperate, trying to raise money to take her to a private doctor because at the clinic all she can get is acetaminophen." The information hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Iris was sick. The same child who had offered her coins to help him was suffering, needing medical care that her caretaker couldn't afford. He found Elm Street easily. It was one of the oldest streets in town, with simple colonial houses that had seen better days. Mrs. Judy's house was a small construction with peeling paint and a side yard where an additional room had been built. When he knocked on the front door, a lady in her 70s answered. "Are you Mrs. Judy?" "I'm looking for Bernice." "She's not here," the lady replied suspiciously. "She left early to work, only comes back at night." "And the girl?" "Iris is here, but she's sleeping. She spent all night coughing, poor thing." Richard felt a pang in his chest. Can I wait?" Mrs. Judy sized him up from head to toe, clearly recognizing his expensive clothes and the imported car parked in front of the house. "Who are you?" "I'm a former employer of Bernice. I wanted to talk to her about a job opportunity." The lie came out more easily than he expected. Mrs. Judy hesitated, but finally let him into the small, modestly furnished living room. That's when he heard the cough. It was a dry, persistent cough that came from the back room. Between the coughing fits, he could hear a tiny voice humming a children's song, probably trying to calm herself. "She's been like this for 2 weeks," Mrs. Judy said, noticing his concern. "Bernice is desperate. She's already taken her to the clinic 3 times, but they say it's just a cold. But what cold takes 2 weeks to go away?" Richard knew that cough. His own nephew had had pneumonia 2 years ago, and the sound was very similar. Iris needed tests, proper medication, possibly hospitalization. "Where does Bernice work?" he asked. "In the morning, she cleans Dr. Miller's office, the dentist. In the afternoon, she cleans Mrs. Sandler's store. And at night, she works at Tony's diner washing dishes." 3 jobs. Bernice worked in 3 different places, probably earning very little in each, just to manage to support herself and the girl. And still, it wasn't enough to afford proper medical treatment. Iris's cough intensified, followed by a low, tired cry. Mrs. Judy got up to check on the girl, and Richard, without thinking, followed her. The room was tiny, with a single bed leaning against the wall and a few belongings organized in boxes. Iris was lying down, her face red with fever, her big eyes shining with tears. When she saw Richard, she tried to smile. "Hi, Mr. from the supermarket," she said in a hoarse voice. "Did you come to visit me?" Richard knelt beside the bed, something he had never done for any child in his life. "Hi, Iris. How are you feeling?" "I'm a little tired," she replied, trying to sit up. "But I'm drawing birds. Do you want to see?" She pointed to the wall next to the bed, where there were several drawings made with cheap colored pencils. They were simple birds, but there was something touching about the way she drew them. Always flying, always free. "Why do you like birds so much?" Richard asked. "Because they can fly anywhere," Iris replied, her eyes shining despite the fever. "When I grow up, I want to fly too. I want to take Aunt Bernice to a beautiful place where she doesn't have to work so much." The girl's words pierced something deep in Richard's chest. At 4 years old, Iris already understood the sacrifice that Bernice made for her. And even sick, even in precarious conditions, she dreamed not of things for herself, but of a better future for the person who took care of her. Mrs. Judy approached with a glass of water. "Iris, you need to take your medicine." The girl grimaced but obeyed. Richard noticed that it was just a common syrup, the kind you buy over the counter. Nothing that was really effective for a serious respiratory infection. "Mrs. Judy, may I ask a question? Does Bernice really not have the money to take Iris to a private doctor?" The lady sighed. "Sir, she earns $1,200 a month in the 3 jobs together. She pays $300 rent here, plus food, plus other necessities. There's little left. And a private doctor costs at least $200 a consultation, not counting the tests he may order. $200. A ridiculous amount for Richard in normal times, barely enough for lunch at the most expensive restaurant in town. But for Bernice, it represented almost a fifth of her monthly income. Iris began to cough again, a stronger attack that left her breathless for a few seconds. When she stopped, she was clearly exhausted. "Mister," she said softly, "do you have kids?" "No," Richard replied. "Then can you be my friend? I don't have many friends." Something broke inside Richard's chest. For 52 years of his life, he had focused exclusively on building wealth, on accumulating power and status. He had never stopped to think about what really mattered. And there was a 4-year-old child, sick and in precarious conditions, offering him something that no money could buy: genuine friendship. "Sure," he said, his voice more emotional than he intended. "I would really like to be your friend." Iris smiled, a smile that lit up the entire small, dark room. And at that moment, Richard realized that his search for Bernice had taken a completely different direction than he had planned. He was no longer just looking for the woman who had possibly ruined his business life. He was looking for a way to help a child who had touched his heart in a way he didn't even know was possible. Bernice arrived home at 10 o'clock at night, exhausted after another day of triple work. she found Richard sitting in Mrs. Judy's small living room, holding the hand of Iris, who had finally managed to fall asleep after another coughing fit. The shock on her face was evident. 5 years after the humiliating dismissal, her former boss was there, in the house where she lived on charity, next to the girl she loved like a daughter. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low so as not to wake Iris, but full of tension. "Bernice, we need to talk," Richard said, getting up carefully so as not to disturb the child. They went out to the small backyard of the house. Bernice crossed her arms, clearly defensive. She was thinner than he remembered, with deep lines of fatigue around her eyes, but she maintained the dignified posture that had always characterized her. "If you came here to threaten me or try to buy me off, you can leave now," she said directly. No," Richard hesitated. During the hours he had spent next to Iris, his initial motivations had completely transformed. "Bernice, I know you reported me to the IRS." She stared at him with a confused expression. "What are you talking about?" "The irregularities you discovered in 2019, the documents you brought to my office before I fired you. Someone gave that information to the IRS." Bernice was silent for a long moment, processing his words. Then, to Richard's surprise, she began to laugh, a bitter, humorless laugh. "You think it was me?" she said, shaking her head. "Richard, I lost all those documents when I was evicted from my apartment 3 months after you fired me. I couldn't pay the rent with the money I was earning cleaning houses. Everything I had went into the trash, including any papers related to your company." The revelation hit Richard like a lightning bolt. "Then who—" "I have no idea, and frankly I don't care," Bernice said, her voice hardening. "You did to me exactly what you deserve to have done to you. You humiliated me, threw me away as if I were nothing, and still had the audacity to refuse a letter of recommendation." Richard lowered his head. The guilt he had been carrying for days intensified. "Bernice, You what?" she interrupted. "Are you going to apologize now? 5 years later, when your life is falling apart and you need my help?" "Your life is falling apart too," Richard replied, raising his eyes to meet hers. "Iris is very sick, Bernice. She needs a doctor, tests, possibly hospitalization. You're killing yourself in 3 jobs and still can't give her what she needs." The words hit Bernice's most sensitive point. Her defenses crumbled instantly, and tears began to run down her face. "You think I don't know that?" she whispered. "You think I don't spend the nights awake, listening to her cough, knowing that I don't have the money to help her? Iris isn't even my biological daughter, but I love her more than my own life." "What do you mean she's not your daughter?" Richard asked, surprised. Bernice wiped the tears with the back of her hand. "I found her 2 years ago, abandoned on the church doorstep. She was only 2 years old, hungry, scared, crying for a mother who would never come back. I tried to hand her over to Child Protective Services, but they were going to put her in an overcrowded shelter. I couldn't let that happen." Iris's story was even more tragic than Richard had imagined. An abandoned child, cared for by a woman who could barely support herself, but who had chosen to give love where others would only see a burden. "Bernice," he said softly, "let me help." "With what money?" She laughed bitterly. "Your accounts are blocked, remember? The whole town is talking about your situation." It was true. But Richard had kept an amount of cash in his home safe, about $50,000 that he kept for emergencies. Money that Mary didn't know existed. "I have how to pay for her treatment," he said, "and I want to do it." "Why?" Bernice studied him suspiciously. "What's your interest in this?" Richard looked through the small window of the room, where he could see Iris sleeping, her face still red with fever. How to explain that a 4-year-old child had touched a part of his soul that he thought he had lost forever? "Because she offered me her coins in the supermarket when I was in the worst situation of my life," he said finally. "A child who has almost nothing offered everything she had to help a stranger. That's a lesson it took me 52 years to learn." At that moment, Tom appeared at the gate of the house, clearly agitated. "Richard, I finally found you." I need to talk to you urgently. Not now, Tom, Richard said, annoyed by the interruption. It's about the complaint, Tom insisted. I found out who did it. Richard and Bernice turned to him immediately. Who was it? Richard asked. Tom hesitated, looking nervously at Bernice. Maybe it's better if we talk in private. You can speak in front of her, Richard said. It was Mary, Tom said finally, the words coming out like a confession. Your wife made the report. The world seemed to stop around Richard. What did you say? She came to me 6 months ago. She said she had found old documents in your office at home and that she was concerned about the legal implications. She asked me for advice on how to proceed. And you advised her to report me? Richard's voice was low, dangerous. No, Tom protested. I told her to talk to you first. But she said she had already tried and that you didn't take her seriously on company matters. So she made the report herself. Tom lowered his head. Yes. And Richard, there's more. She's selling the company's properties. She has brokers for 2 weeks negotiating with investors from Pittsburgh. She's preparing to leave town. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Mary had not only destroyed his business life, but was running away with what was left of his assets. And Tom, his confidant, had facilitated it all. Why are you telling me this now? Richard asked. Because she promised me that we would leave together, Tom admitted, his voice breaking. But today I found out that she has already bought tickets just for herself. She's going to leave me here to face the consequences along with you. Bernice watched the entire revelation in silence, her expression gradually changing from distrust to something akin to compassion. The man who had ruined her life was now living his own destruction, betrayed by the people he trusted most. Richard, she said softly, I'm sorry. He looked at her, surprised by the genuineness in her voice. After everything he had done to her, Bernice was able to feel compassion for his suffering. No, he said, shaking his head. You shouldn't feel sorry for me. I deserved all this. The way I treated you, how I treated other people. This is just karma catching up. At that moment, Iris's cough started again, stronger than before. The 3 adults turned to the window, worried. She needs to go to the hospital now, Bernice said, running into the house. Richard didn't hesitate. My car is here. Let's take her. During the drive to the hospital, with Iris coughing in Bernice's lap in the back seat, Richard made the most important decision of his life. No matter what happened to his company, his marriage, his reputation, he would use every penny he still had to ensure that the girl received the best possible treatment. And when Iris, even feverish and sick, held his hand and whispered, "Thank you, friend," Richard finally understood what it really meant to be rich. It wasn't the millions in the bank. It wasn't the social status or the business power. It was having someone who trusted you, who considered you family, even without blood ties. 3 hours later, with Iris admitted and stabilized, diagnosed with pneumonia but responding well to treatment, Richard and Bernice sat in the hospital waiting room. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'm the one who thanks you," he replied. "You both taught me something I had forgotten a long time ago. What? That true wealth is not what you have. It's what you are able to give." 18 months later, Richard worked as a salesman in Joe's hardware store, earning minimum wage, but having for the first time in decades the feeling that he was living with dignity. Iris, completely recovered, attended a private school that he paid for with his new modest earnings. Bernice had returned to work as an accountant at a small company in town, and every Thursday the 3 of them had dinner together at the simple house they rented, a chosen family, united not by blood, but by genuine love, and by the understanding that the best things in life cannot be bought, only offered with an open heart. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment. Your opinion is very important, and if you love beautiful stories, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.